On a moonless night along the Mississippi River, 36 miles north of New Orleans, a sugar plantation lay in deceptive quiet. Inside the grand house at Woodland Plantation, Major Manuel Andre, militia colonel, slaveholder, and one of the most powerful men in the German coast slept soundly. Outside, in the quarters where enslaved people lived, something was stirring. Whispers had been traveling for weeks. A date had been set, and on this night, everything would change. What Manuel Andre didn't know was that in a few hours, he would be fleeing for his life, his son would be dead, and between 200 and 500 enslaved people would be marching toward New Orleans with military precision, armed with weapons, flying flags, and beating drums, the largest slave revolt in United States history. Why has this massive uprising been nearly erased from American memory? Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past, which help shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. 8 years to 1803. The Louisiana Purchase had just transferred this vast territory from French to American control, and nowhere was the transition more volatile than along the German coast. The German coast wasn't actually German anymore. Named for the German farmers who had settled there decades earlier, by 1811, it was the heart of Louisiana's booming sugar industry. The land along the Mississippi, stretching from present-day Laplace to Destrehan, had been transformed into a landscape of enormous plantations with names like Woodland, Fortier, Trepignier, and Kenner. What happens when you combine three different legal systems, cultural expectations, and ideas about slavery in one region? The enslaved population had lived under French law, then Spanish law, and now found themselves under American law. Under the French Code Noir and Spanish law, enslaved people had limited rights. They could earn money, sometimes purchase their freedom, and had legal protections against the worst abuses. The law even mandated that enslaved people be given Sundays off and be instructed in Catholicism. But American law was different, harsher, more absolute in its denial of humanity. Among the hundreds of enslaved people working the German coast plantations, several men emerged as natural leaders. Like Charles Dessalines was the driver, overseer, at the Andre plantation. This position, forcing enslaved people to work for white masters, was one of the most hated roles in the slave system. But it also gave Charles access to information, freedom of movement, and authority. He was described as a mulatto from Saint-Domingue, Haiti, which meant he likely witnessed or heard stories about the Haitian Revolution. Think about that for a moment. Charles Dessalines came from Haiti, where enslaved people had successfully overthrown their masters and created the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. That revolution had begun in 1791 and concluded with Haiti's independence in 1804, just 7 years before the German coast uprising. If you had witnessed the impossible become possible in Haiti, would you believe it could happen in Louisiana? Alongside Dessalines were other leaders whose names have survived. Cook and Kwamana, possibly of African origin, Harry Kenner, and others whose names were lost to history. Some were skilled craftsmen, others field workers. Together, they began to plan something unprecedented. Planning a slave revolt was perhaps the most dangerous undertaking imaginable. Discovery meant torture and execution. Trust was everything. One informant could doom the entire enterprise. Yet somehow, throughout 1810, word spread across multiple plantations. The conspirators met in secret, likely on Sundays when enslaved people had more freedom of movement. They met in the woods, in the slave quarters after dark, during rare moments when masters weren't watching. The whispers moved from plantation to plantation, a date, a plan, freedom. They studied the land. The German coast was a narrow strip of civilization along the Mississippi River, hemmed in by swamps. There was essentially one road, the river road that connected the plantations and led to New Orleans. This geography would both help and hinder them. They counted weapons. Some plantations had armories for the militia. They knew where tools could become weapons: cane knives, axes, hoes. They began to stockpile what they could hide. What was their endgame? Were they planning to take New Orleans? Establish a free territory? Escape to Spanish Florida or Mexico. The Haitian Revolution was the nightmare that kept slaveholders awake at night. Between 1791 and 1804, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue had risen up, defeated the French colonial army, resisted invasions by Spanish and British forces, and established Haiti as an independent nation. It was the only successful slave revolt in history that resulted in an independent nation. And refugees from that revolution, both white planters and free people of color, had flooded into Louisiana by the thousands, bringing stories, trauma, and in some cases, revolutionary ideas. Some of the enslaved people brought to Louisiana from Saint-Domingue had participated in the revolution. American slaveholders were terrified that the contagion of rebellion would spread. They weren't wrong to worry. By late 1810, conditions on the German coast were deteriorating. The sugar harvest was brutal work. The American planters were pushing harder, working enslaved people longer hours, caring less about the old customs that had provided tiny breathing spaces under French and Spanish rule. There were other tensions, too. The War of 1812 was approaching, though it hadn't yet begun. There were rumors of Spanish intrigue from Texas, British agents stirring trouble, and general uncertainty about this new American government. The enslaved population outnumbered white residents by approximately 2 to 1. On some plantations, the ratio was even more skewed. The masters lived in luxury built on forced labor, always watching over their shoulders, always knowing that they were outnumbered by people who had every reason to hate them. One plantation owner wrote that the enslaved people seemed restless and insolent. He didn't understand why. Or perhaps he understood perfectly well and couldn't admit it. By early January 1811, everything was ready. The leaders had set a date. The word had gone out. Hundreds of people across multiple plantations were preparing to risk everything. What happens when the oppressed decide they have nothing left to lose? It began at Woodland Plantation, Manuel Andre's estate, around 8 or 9 p.m. on January 8th. Charles Deslands and a group of conspirators armed themselves with axes, hoes, and cane knives. Some accounts say they had stolen guns. They moved through the darkness toward the main house. Inside, Manuel Andre and his son Gilbert were unaware that their world was about to explode. These were men who had total control over hundreds of human beings, who could buy and sell people at will, who wielded the power of life and death. In moments, that power would mean nothing. The rebels struck hard and fast. They broke into the house, weapons raised. Gilbert Andre was killed, hacked to death with axes and cane knives. Manuel Andre, despite being wounded, managed to escape. In his night clothes, bleeding from multiple wounds, the 59-year-old major fled into the darkness. Think about this moment. Manuel Andre had been sleeping peacefully, secure in his power, his wealth, his position. In minutes, he was running for his life. How complete must the reversal have felt? The rebels ransacked the plantation. They took weapons, muskets, and ammunition from Andre's armory. They took horses, they set fires, and then, critically, they began to organize. What happened next distinguishes the German coast uprising from most slave revolts in American history. This wasn't a spontaneous eruption of violence that burned itself out quickly. This was organized, military, and purposeful. Charles Deslands and the other leaders organized the rebels into a column. They created flags. They had drums beating, the rhythms of communication, of African tradition, of defiance. They marched in formation. As they moved down the river road toward New Orleans, they stopped at plantation after plantation. At each one, they called for the enslaved people to join them. Some came willingly, having been in on the conspiracy. Others joined in the moment, swept up in the revolution happening before their eyes. Still others were forced to come or stayed loyal to their masters. At each plantation, the pattern repeated. They would attack the main house if the owner resisted. They would gather weapons, more guns, more ammunition, more tools that could serve as weapons. They would take food and supplies, and then they would move on, their numbers swelling. Estimates of their numbers vary wildly from as low as 200 to as high as 500. The truth is probably somewhere in between, But the uncertainty itself tells us something. The white population was terrified, and fear tends to inflate numbers. But even at the lower estimates, this was an army. They marched through the night and into the next day. Plantation after plantation fell before them or submitted without resistance. They covered roughly 35 to 40 miles along the river road, moving southeast toward New Orleans. The night sky lit up with fires. Plantation buildings burned. The drums echoed across the flat delta landscape. The unthinkable was happening. For the white population of the German coast, January 8th to 9th, 1811, was the apocalypse. Everything they had feared, everything they had used as justification for their brutal control, was manifesting before them. Families fled their plantations in terror. Some hid in slave quarters, protected by enslaved people who chose loyalty over freedom, a complexity worth examining. Others fled downriver toward New Orleans or upriver away from the march. Some took to boats on the Mississippi. Women clutched their children and ran through the darkness. Men grabbed what weapons they could find and either fled or tried to organize resistance. The social order that had seemed so permanent, so natural to them, evaporated in hours. How many of these terrified white people had sold children away from their mothers? How many had wielded the whip? How many had built their wealth on the suffering of the people now marching against them? This isn't to justify violence, but to understand it. Terror was the weapon of slavery, terror of the whip, of being sold away from family, of arbitrary punishment, of rape, of death. Now that terror was reversed, and the masters learned what it felt like. For the rebels, this was both liberation and terror of a different kind. They knew that if they failed, and when they failed, as some must have suspected, the retribution would be unspeakable. They were past the point of no return from the moment they struck the first blow. There could be no mercy, no forgiveness, no return to the way things were. They had to win completely or die. On January 9th, the rebel army continued its march. They moved with purpose, with organization, with discipline that surprised and terrified white observers who later described the events. One white witness described seeing the rebels marching in formation, carrying flags, with drummers keeping time. He spoke of their military appearance, their organization, their apparent unity of purpose. This wasn't a mob, it was an army. They numbered now in the hundreds. Some reports say they were organized into companies with officers. Whether this was actual military structure or the imposition of familiar forms onto what was observed, we can't be certain. But something about their presentation suggested planning, coordination, and leadership. Where were they going? The evidence suggests they were marching on New Orleans itself. New Orleans, with its 24,000 residents, approximately 42% of whom were enslaved, was the prize. It was the economic and political capital of Louisiana. It held wealth, weapons, and strategic importance. Did they actually believe they could take New Orleans? Or was the march itself the point, a demonstration of power, a statement of resistance, a moment of freedom that was worth the inevitable price? As news of the uprising spread, the reactions came fast and terrified. Manuel Andre, wounded but alive, had made it to safety and raised the alarm. He gathered the scattered militia forces and began organizing a response. Messengers rode hard to New Orleans with news that seemed impossible. Hundreds of slaves, armed and organized, marching on the city. In New Orleans, Governor William C. Claiborne received the news with shock. He immediately called out the militia and sent urgent requests for federal troops. He dispatched 2 companies of volunteer militia and 30 regular army troops under the command of Brigadier General Wade Hampton toward the German coast. The United States had been a nation for less than 30 years. Louisiana had been American territory for only 8 years. And now, in this crucial territory, the largest slave revolt in the nation's history was unfolding. Claiborne's letters from those days reveal his panic. He wrote of fears that the rebellion might spread, that it might reach New Orleans itself, that the entire slave system of Louisiana might collapse. The governor of a U.S. territory was genuinely afraid that enslaved people might successfully revolt. What does that tell us about the precariousness of the entire system of slavery? Across the South, slaveholders had always known that they were outnumbered, that their power rested on violence and terror rather than consent. The German Coast Uprising was that fear made real. By January 10th, the rebel army had been marching and fighting for more than 36 hours. They had covered significant ground, but they had also lost the element of surprise. The alarm had been raised. Forces were mobilizing against them. The rebels made camp at Bernard Bernoudy's plantation, about 15 miles from New Orleans. They were tired. They might have been celebrating their freedom, however temporary, or perhaps they were gathering strength for the final push toward the city. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to be caught in a pincer movement. From upriver, Manuel André had organized a militia force of about 80 men. Despite his wounds, the 59-year-old major was leading a counterattack against the people who had killed his son and destroyed his plantation. His force included planters and their supporters from the German coast, men who had everything to lose if the rebellion succeeded. From downriver, coming up from New Orleans, came the federal and militia forces under General Wade Hampton. 2 companies of volunteer militia and 30 regular troops, well armed and trained. The rebels were about to be caught between 2 forces, and they knew it. On January 10th, the 2 forces converged on the rebel position. The details of the battle are frustratingly sparse. We know what happened. We know the rebels fought. But the accounts we have are from the white militia and military forces, and they tend to downplay any resistance that might suggest the rebels were formidable opponents. What we know, the battle was swift and brutal. The rebels, armed mostly with agricultural tools and a limited number of stolen firearms, faced trained militia and regular troops with superior weapons and discipline. Some rebels fought fiercely. Others tried to flee. The disciplined formation that had marched so impressively down the river road broke apart under fire. The drums fell silent. The flags fell. Imagine being in that battle. You've had 2 days of freedom, 2 days of walking as a free person, of carrying a weapon openly, of not bowing and scraping before white masters, and now the full weight of the military is bearing down on you. Do you fight? Do you run? Do you die on your feet rather than return to slavery? The accounts say that 40 to 45 rebels were killed in the battle itself. Dozens more were captured. Still others fled into the swamps, hoping the dense wetlands would hide them from pursuit. Charles Dessalines, the leader who had started it all, was among those who escaped the immediate battle. But he wouldn't get far. What followed the battle was a manhunt. The white militia and volunteer forces spread out across the German coast, searching for rebels who had fled. They used dogs. They searched the swamps, the slave quarters, every hiding place they could imagine. For the next several days, the hunt continued. Captured rebels were interrogated, tortured to reveal the names of other participants and the locations of those who had escaped. One by one, they were found, dragged from hiding places, pulled from the swamps, betrayed by those who sought to save themselves or by enslaved people who had remained loyal to their masters. Charles Dessalines was captured on January 11th. Between January 13th and 15th, trials were held for the captured rebels. These weren't trials in any meaningful sense. They were legal proceedings designed to give a veneer of justice to predetermined outcomes. The courts that tried the rebels were plantation courts, held on the very plantations that the rebels had attacked. The judges were plantation owners. There were no lawyers for the defense, no witnesses called on behalf of the accused, no possibility of acquittal for most. The accused were brought forward, their names recorded, the charges read: insurrection, murder, arson. The verdicts came quickly: guilty. The sentences were uniform: death. What would these men have said if given a chance to speak? What testimony would they have given about their lives, their treatment, their reasons for rebellion? We'll never know. The system that enslaved them also ensured their silence, even in their final hours. The executions started immediately. Some rebels were shot by firing squad. Others were hanged. The bodies were not buried with dignity. They were not returned to grieving families for proper funeral rites. What happened next reveals the true horror of slavery more clearly than almost anything else in American history. The executions alone weren't enough. The slaveholders wanted to send a message so clear, so terrifying, that no one would ever think of rebelling again. They decapitated the executed rebels. Then they mounted the heads on poles along the river road, from the Andre plantation all the way to New Orleans, roughly 40 miles. Imagine that. 40 miles of human heads on spikes. This wasn't just execution, it was terrorism. Every enslaved person who traveled that road, every free person of color, every visitor to the region would see those heads and understand the message. This is what happens to those who resist. What kind of society does this to human beings? And what does it tell us that we've largely forgotten this atrocity? The heads remained on display for an extended period, weeks to months. They rotted in the Louisiana heat and humidity. They were pecked at by birds. They served as a constant reminder of the price of freedom. Charles Dessalines, the leader of the uprising, was singled out for special punishment. His execution was designed to be as horrific as possible, a spectacle of suffering meant to destroy any thoughts of rebellion in those who witnessed it. Dessalines was sentenced to be burned alive, but even that wasn't enough. According to multiple accounts, they shot him in the legs first to immobilize him without killing him. Then they put him on a pile of straw and set it on fire. He was burned alive, conscious in agony. After his death, his body was mutilated further. His head was mounted on a pole like the others. This is what the peculiar institution of slavery did to those who resisted it. This is what order and civilization looked like in the antebellum South. The men who ordered this are plantation owners, militia officers, government officials who would go on to live respected lives. Some would have parishes named after them. Some would be remembered in local histories as pillars of the community. The men they tortured and killed would be largely forgotten. In the weeks following the uprising, life on the German coast tried to return to normal, which is to say, the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor resumed. But nothing was quite the same. The slaveholders had been terrified. They had seen how quickly their world could be upended. They had run through the night in fear for their lives. They couldn't forget it, no matter how many heads they mounted on poles. They tightened restrictions. They increased patrols. They watched their enslaved workers with even more suspicion and fear. They coordinated better with each other and with the government in New Orleans. The enslaved population had to live under those rotting heads, working in the same fields for the same masters, knowing that some of their fellow enslaved people had tasted freedom and paid the ultimate price for it. With the trial records, we know some of the names of those who were executed. Charles Dessalines, the leader, burned alive. Cook and Quamana, listed as commanders in some accounts, executed. Harry Kenner, from the Kenner plantation, executed. Jean Baptiste, executed. Linder, executed. Gros, executed. Quamana's wife was also executed, one of the few women specifically mentioned in the records, suggesting she played a significant role. It's January 9th, 1811. The sun is rising over the Mississippi River. Charles Dessalines stands at the head of a column of hundreds of formerly enslaved people. They're organized in formation, carrying flags, with drummers keeping time. They're marching down River Road toward New Orleans. For this moment, this brief, shining moment, they are free. Not legally, not permanently, but free in the way that matters most. They've made the choice to risk everything rather than continue living in bondage. They're acting as free people, making their own decisions, fighting for their own liberation. The sun is shining. The drums are beating. The Mississippi River flows beside them. And they are free. That moment existed. Those people existed. Their courage was real. Their sacrifice was real. Their story is part of American history, whether or not we've chosen to remember it. And now you know their story. Now you're part of the small but growing number of people who refuse to let them be forgotten. Now, you can answer the question that opened this narrative. Why has the largest slave revolt in United States history been nearly erased from American memory? You know the answer now. And knowing the answer means you have a responsibility to remember, to share, to ensure that Charles Dessalines and the rebels of the German coast uprising are finally given their place in history. Their march may have ended in defeat and death, but their story doesn't have to end in silence.